Good afternoon and welcome to INCITE in Conversation. My name is Andrew Finnegan and I am the editor of INCITE magazine. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, whom I acknowledge as the traditional owners of this land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So, to start, the usual Zoom housekeeping. Please keep your computers set to mute and your cameras off. Also, please do use the group chat function if you want to make any comments or ask any questions. We will have time to answer questions towards the end of the session. Today, I am joined by Brendan Fitzgerald and Cameron Morley to talk about scenario planning in libraries. This follows on from the INCITE article, All Things Considered, which Brendan co-wrote with Dr. Matt Finch and Miley Joseph. Brendan is a director of library consultancy 641DI. He works on library and not-for-profit strategy with a particular focus on library infrastructure, digital inclusion, and understanding loneliness. 641DI is currently working in partnership with Civica to produce The One Thing, a thought leadership project for public libraries across Asia Pacific. Cameron Morley has a background as a reference librarian in the reading rooms of the State Library of New South Wales and has worked for most of his career in public library development. His achievements include securing and managing significant funding for New South Wales public libraries and promoting library improvements through the development of standards and guidelines for spaces and services, many of which have been adopted nationally and overseas. So, firstly, to start off, could you each tell us a bit about what scenario planning is and how you've utilised it in your work? And I'll start with Cameron.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you from Garigal land on the northern outskirts of Sydney. Well, I guess scenario planning is really about imagining what might happen in the longer term and bigger picture things. Also, it's a chance to get creative. So we have a lot of fun and get creative when it comes to working out scenarios and how libraries might respond to them. I think one of the questions that we often get is it similar to business continuity planning? And the answer would be, it's not. You know, business continuity planning is something that probably every council has, but that's setting up a quick fire response to some sort of acute situation that's arising, like if there's a flood in the library or an IT outage, and more of a response via a spreadsheet. You know, if X happens, we implement Y straight away. Whereas strategic planning or scenario planning is looking at a wide range of possible eventualities that may or may not have a direct influence on the library, and then identify what responses or opportunities that we could implement depending on what eventuates.
I'll take that as a cue, Cameron.
Yeah, Brendan, I should.
It's good to see you again, and also acknowledge the traditional owners from all the lands that we gather on in this meeting or this gathering. Yeah, look, I think in Cameron's point around looking at futures that that may be not so plausible can actually be quite valuable, because you can learn a lot from thinking about the possibilities of how you navigate particular situations that you may not necessarily see in the future. So, think about, the storytelling of things like the tortoise and the hare. I mean, it's non-existent in many ways, but you can learn a lot from looking at that situation and thinking about it. And certainly in the context of where we've been with this pandemic, just thinking back to some of the work that myself and Matt and Miley had done with the workshops a couple of years ago at the State Library of New South Wales, and preceding that back to the bookend scenarios back in 2008 or 9, Cameron, I think it was. The whole idea that a pandemic would emerge was probably seen as quite an implausible future, and yet through that kind of planning and that thinking that the State Library of New South Wales and the public librarians across New South Wales did, over a decade ago, I think positioned them quite well to manage that. That crisis certainly last year. It's certainly very, very different now. I think it's changed. Again, that's changed. That uncertainty that future that was imagined, over a decade ago is now continuing to change and to create further uncertainty. However, those sort of things like continuity plans, the strategic plans that libraries would have had in place and councils would have had in place around bushfires and flooding, etc., and other, potential crises. That they've actually put them in good stead to really, I think, face up to things like what's happening now. So that whole exercise in scenario planning, allowing people to think really broadly about what is possible and how they meet that challenge, and also the other key thing around scenario planning is trying to look at the blind spots, because it's out of the blind spots and out of those emerging blind spots that you have to kind of attack at some point in the future. It's not always the comfortable futures that that allow you to kind of work your way through such things as a crisis like a pandemic. So in a sense, it's looking at that kind of, I suppose it helps you in the decision making. It's a method, I suppose, to support decision making, thinking about and creating alternative futures and how you're going to make those decisions into the future.
So you talk a little bit about scenarios that are implausible or plausible. Just to elaborate, what kinds of situations and scenarios do you look at through a scenario planning process?
You go, Brendan. Sorry.
How do they range from the really realistic, we can really imagine this happening, to aliens attacking from Mars?
Well, I don't see why not. In one sense, the plausibility or implausibility of a future is probably not particularly relevant. It's more around what are those things in the future that will be uncertain that you're going to have to navigate, and trying to identify those. And sometimes looking further out into in a future where libraries are going to have to, how do we actually develop library membership cards for aliens? Could be, there could be some incredible value around looking at what that scenario, what sort of falls out of that scenario, and how we actually, change our services. One of the things about the just on kind of thinking about scenarios being plausible, they're not always crisis or chaos. There's some examples we've seen where there was one in the US where a library which was in charge, it's probably 5-6 years ago, in charge of a small grant program, about $100,000 given to them each year by a philanthropic. One year they gave them over $1 million. I think it was closer to 2 or 3 to deliver, but with no additional staff to manage that process. So they got a really good thing and a really positive thing, but yet couldn't actually deliver on it because they simply weren't able to do that. So that wasn't in their scenario thinking, in a sense, or their planning.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Brendan. And I think the what's plausible to one person might be implausible to another person. And I guess I can give some examples that came up during the bookend scenarios work we did initially in 2007. Then we did it again 2014. And we've done it a couple of times since with a few committees. But basically what we did, we had scenario planning experts do a series of workshops with around 150 public library staff, brainstorming these possible timelines. So the start of it was looking at what got libraries to where we were, like in 2007, 2008. And there were a whole lot of things that came up over, the preceding decades that were that got us where we were today. And many of those things might have been unexpected at the time, obviously. And then from that point, we looked forward to 2030, where we would want to be in 2030, and what possible or probable or left field things might pop up during that period. So it's really about getting people to think without shackles. And as Brendan said, there could be something really implausible, such as aliens, but the thinking you would go through in terms of how would we do a library card for them, for example, that sort of thinking gets you to think about library membership from a completely different angle, and you might come up with a whole lot of things along the way that you hadn't thought of. So that's really what we would be looking for people to do. So we had this thing that really stood out to me in 2007. There was this thing rumoured coming called the iPad. It hadn't been released, but people knew it was going to be a tablet. And a lot of people in the room couldn't work out how an electronic tablet could even be useful. They were, in terms of, it wouldn't be as good as a laptop or a phone. What would you do with it? And obviously, since they got released, there's probably a whole lot of things that came out. So, but for some people, that was an implausible thing. Also, the global pandemic, which is really interesting that it did come up in those initial conversations. People thought it was implausible, but we did know that doing the timeline in 1919, and that's the only time the State Library had ever been closed to the public, was during the 1919 flu. So that was part of the timeline. And then not far before that time in 2007, 5 years earlier, there'd been SARS in Hong Kong, which was kind of fresh in people's minds. So it wasn't really far-fetched, but you need to bring that into your thinking. And I guess the one thing that really came out of it that I always thought was implausible was Commonwealth funding for public libraries. And that still hasn't happened. And maybe some people think aliens might be more likely than that one. But I think we also identified a bunch of things that, you know, seem to have come true. Like, and when I say we're talking about a big group of public library staff. It wasn't just the State Library people. You know, the things about just basic things like less trust in government and information and institutions, format proliferation being out of control and, you know, causing mayhem for libraries and for people, you know, activism and environmentalism. But I think what we didn't think about was that the activism might actually be coming from, you know, the sorts of people who don't trust governments and don't trust, you know, the sort of stuff that we're seeing right now happening in the US and then, you know, unfortunately a little bit in Australia, where people aren't trusting the information and the activism is sort of almost coming from the side that you wouldn't expect it. And also things like a resurgence of retro formats like vinyl. They're really interesting things that when you put it all together, it comes up with something that, you know, what does this mean in terms of a library response? How do we thrive in this environment? So I guess, yeah, the implausibility, almost in some ways, the more implausible, the better, because it gets you to think.
Yeah. Could I just add to that too, Cameron? The work we did with State Library New South Wales and the Library Managers in 2019, actually there was one of the groups came up with a very implausible idea around a small nuclear war happening in Indonesia and China, kind of that area. And that one of the outcomes would be that borders in Australia would actually close. And, you know, it wasn't the war that, you know, an imaginary war that caused that, but in fact, we're now in a situation where borders are closed in Australia. So, you know, 2 years ago, that was an implausible scenario, and within 2 years, here we are living that. And I like your vinyl analogy too, because, you know, if it wasn't for like underground movements like the Scratchers and the hip hoppers, it probably wouldn't have survived. So it's kind of interesting how, you know, and formats like CD-ROMs have now disappeared, which were going to be the great thing in the mid-90s. So, you know, when you try and predict things into the future, it becomes very, very difficult. Whereas scenario planning can allow you to think about how to manage a future where, you know, the specific format doesn't matter so much, or the situation doesn't matter so much.
Now, you've already talked about a little bit about how elements of fun and creativity is involved in scenario planning. So how can imagination and storytelling skills help enhance the scenario planning process?
I think if you don't have a story that potentially has gaps in it, that's when you get people to start think about the gaps. That was really the catalyst for people to be coming up with, I think, brilliant ideas, because so it was a really narrative-based situation. And I think then, you know, the timeline that I mentioned was all factual up until 2007. And when we did it again in 2014, we sort of filled in a lot of the blanks up to 2014. And then from when you start looking at the future, you're almost sort of trying to see what's already happening. Because I think it's the William Gibson quote that came up all the time, which is that, you know, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I think that's really clear. So there's a bunch of things that when you look back in time, you say, oh, that was already happening, but something that was happening at the same time didn't progress. So it's really trying to include everything and tell a story around it where we actually went into 4 different directions with a possible future to 2030. And within those 4 possible directions, you know, some of which were, you know, really apocalyptic and others which were very much everything's sort of online and cyber, and the other one where there's a swing back to environmentalism and doing everything local and revering older formats, all that sort of stuff. They're all kind of opposite, but they could all actually be happening at the same time. So I think without storytelling, it might end up being a little bit more like that business continuity spreadsheet, which isn't as exciting, and I think also doesn't lend to that creativity.
Yeah. The business continuity, it's a great use the term spreadsheet, because in a sense they're around that kind of robustness of systems. And I remember when I was at the State Library of Victoria, probably early 2006, 7, maybe into 8, we did a lot of work around business continuity planning, and none of that would have probably survived the pandemic. In fact, probably looking back 10, was it now 15 years ago, if a pandemic had have hit then, those BCMs would have been quite, business continuity plans would have been quite useless in many ways. The other thing,
that's really true.
Yeah, absolutely.
We couldn't have done this if it happened in 2008. It would have. We were on the way. Wi-Fi was starting to be through public libraries, for example, but any homes had it. It would have been, and these sorts of technologies where, we would have been in a different basket in the 2008 pandemic.
Yeah, we would have probably stopped, completely. Just on the storytelling too. The other thing that strikes me, and in what I know about the scenario planning process, is that the imagination is actually quite key, because it really opens up the possibilities from which exploring those possibilities starts giving you some answers and how you navigate through. And the more creative you are, the better, in many ways. So, thinking about aliens into the future is probably not from a scenario planning perspective, is probably not a particularly bad thing to do, because it makes you start thinking about, what if, and how do we respond?
So, and you've already touched this again on this again, but in terms of scenario planning in the past in places like the State Library of New South Wales, how has that helped prepare for the global pandemic in terms of how the way you imagine something like that happening compared to the reality of the situation? And was there any, I guess, tangible or intangible difference that the scenario planning made?
I think it's a bit chicken and egg, because the last year, certainly in that first lockdown in New South Wales, the public libraries are really nimble and had very innovative responses to the situation. And I think the way that libraries and councils approached that was pretty amazing. And we were able to share that across the network really, really quickly, with the networks and communication we've got in place. And I think that possibly that scenario planning thinking that we'd done over that 15-year period helped that situation to occur. But also, you could almost argue that the scenario planning went so well because the public library staff were so good at doing that sort of thinking. So I guess we'd like to say that the scenario planning environment was a big key to those responses. But as I say, I mean, we were dealing with people who were really good at scenario planning. So it's probably a bit of an iterative process like that. I think the way that libraries were really quick to implement the better online services as soon as their buildings had to close, the turnaround was like within a fortnight for lots of people. And within another week, there was lots of innovative ways of getting hard copies out to people as well. A little bit different at the moment. The Delta lockdown this year, right now, isn't the same in terms of the responses. And I think libraries have been a bit certainly shackled by the health orders. And there seems to be a bit of movement today. And even as we're speaking, there's emails coming through about some areas possibly being out of lockdown on the weekend. And that might mean their libraries can open. I mean, we're having to respond really quickly. And, for example, this morning, we didn't know that was the case. And if next week a bunch of libraries are allowed to open and a bunch aren't, that gives us, a 2-speed library situation in New South Wales. And, that's going to have its own sort of bit of mayhem associated with it, no doubt.
I guess, I mean, we all came out of lockdown mid to late last year, depending on where you are. And I guess there's been a cautious assumption that coming out of lockdown would happen in a similar way this time. And now we've seen that it's not like that at all, right?
No, I'm trying to think of an analogy. It might be like letting 100 wild horses go at the same time or something. But I'm sure libraries will be calm.
I was thinking I've probably done more time than Chopper Read, to be quite frank, in lockdown. But yeah, look, I think that, back to Cameron's point around the initial response last year, I did some work for State Library New South Wales looking at the response to the pandemic, which we can put the link up to that later. But that speed at which Cameron talked about that the libraries responded was quite amazing in actual fact. And my gut feel, it didn't come out in the evidence, but my gut feel is that a lot of that was built upon both the planning that had gone, a decade before, thinking about what might be. And there were things in those bookend scenarios around, there were comments about, if there's a pandemic, libraries will be an unsafe place to be. And so there was clearly an understanding. It might have been buried a little bit. And also, I should mention too that and Cameron has the bookend scenarios actually did have a series of indicators over a period of time. So it wasn't like the piece of work was done in 2009 and 2014 and forgotten and put on a shelf. There was work continuing on. But the other thing too was a lot of the libraries also had quite recent experience of either floods or bushfires. So they had been in a crisis situation. So that quick response also possibly came from a lived experience. And that matching of looking into the future and looking into your past lived experience and kind of work out what you need to keep doing into the future is quite important and valuable.
Okay, so I've got time for some questions. And so if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat screen. We've got one question from Phoebe, which is, have you been involved in scenario planning strategies in terms of staffing and future skills planning?
Yeah, look, certainly in the 2014 iteration, which we revisited with a few committees in 2018, it was really about what skills do you need to thrive in this environment leading up to 2030 is, I guess, the question. Certainly things that came up were like innovative outreach services for libraries, also engaging with, I guess, people who want to use the library as a creative space. And then it's about other things to do with, really revitalising collections and developing niche collections and being able to then engage with communities based on that. And then also a whole lot of stuff around digitisation, digital engagement as well. So they were all, I think, fairly key things that were mentioned by the participants even way back in 2008. And I guess, hopefully, those sorts of needs have permeated library structures in the ensuing years.
Yeah, look, I won't add anything more to Cameron there. I haven't done anything specific to that other than, some work, for example, Matt and I did at the City of Newcastle looking at the infrastructure plan, where we did some scenario planning with the staff there. That was specifically about what the infrastructure and the model of the library would look like into the future 10 years on. Spilling out of that comes things like, what are the staff skills and capabilities that you need to actually be thinking you need to have in place to match that. And also, what are the just beyond skills, what are the partnerships that you could actually be developing in your community that you haven't actually really looked at, as part of your processes? So there's more than just your own skills, there's the skills and the stakeholders around you.
While waiting for some more questions, one thing I was curious about is, are you aware of scenario planning strategies happening in other related sectors? And perhaps is there an opportunity that we can, I guess, embed ourselves as libraries into the minds of other related organisations when they're considering the future of society?
Look, I'll just quickly jump in. Cameron obviously might have some more specifics to New South Wales, but some of the work that Matt and I had been doing had covered across into the other kind of GLAM areas. So, we did some work at Libraries Tasmania, where we had obviously archives and the public library sector and part of education involved there. So, the tools that we use with the scenario planning certainly cross over into all sorts of other areas. And there's no reason why you couldn't bring in libraries and allied health services. So the tools that are there and the kind of methods, they work across areas quite comfortably. And in fact, they probably, looking into the future, they probably work better coming out of this pandemic, where we might be looking to partners that are maybe in the allied health areas or community health sectors, where we can actually have play a role and work together with those.
And just to, one final question, just to get a bit meta, what might we imagine for the future of scenario planning? So how might scenario planning change in the future?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think for us, things seem to have sped up, and I think we noticed that between 2019 and 2014, that there was a whole lot of predictions that were pretty plausible, but they did come true. But we thought they'd come true by 2030, but they had already happened by 2014. So it was kind of, and this was like things like doubling of Wi-Fi uptake in libraries, for example, didn't take very long at all. I guess it's about redoing it. We're probably up to about the fourth wave of redoing this, and I guess we'd probably want to take it out further than 2030, which isn't very far away, is it? But I guess it's about possibly doing it more often and looking at the sort of identifying the indicators that might be indicating certain scenarios emerging more quickly. So I think it's really embedding what we're doing. Yeah.
Look, I'd probably agree. I'd agree with Cameron on that. The only thing I'd add to that is maybe bring it back down to much more local levels. Certainly, I mentioned the City of Newcastle work, and Matt and I had been planning to do some work with some other libraries across New South Wales, more specifically to their LGAs. So that kind of localized, because often we will look at a scenario as a group of libraries across the state or across a series of borders, or some of the work we did in New Zealand was with Leanza and thinking kind of nationally. That I think that some of those local, embedding this into a local, usable tools that can be used in a local setting, for whether it be a Newcastle or a Campbelltown or a Geelong or whatever, could be quite a valuable pathway to take this to.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's doing it not just at that macro level, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's all we have time for today. So thank you once again for your time, Brendan and Cameron. And also thank you to my colleagues, Jackie and Phoebe, who've been busy working behind the scenes in helping make this session happen. This session has been recorded. We'll email you a link once it's available to view online. If you know somebody who'd be interested in watching it, please feel free to share the link once it's live. INCITE is currently seeking submissions for our upcoming November-December issue, exploring the theme of risk, which is a topic related to today's discussion. So if you're feeling inspired to write something, head over to the ALIA website for more information on our submission guidelines. Our submission deadline is the 21st of September, so you still have some time to get writing. Otherwise, thank you for coming along, and do enjoy the rest of your day.